This will be a lecture over Robert Paxton's article, The Five Stages of Fascism. Now, it's not a coincidence that I'm talking about fascism in 2020, but it might not be for the reasons that you think. When I was in grad school, there weren't really a whole lot of political philosophers talking about fascism. It wasn't really considered to be a live topic. It was a topic that historians and maybe political scientists might want to talk about, but political philosophy wasn't particularly interested. And in fact, actually, Robert Paxton is a historian and political scientist, not technically a political philosopher. But his work has started to fuel a resurgence in the study of fascism in a lot of intellectual and academic disciplines, including political philosophy. So one of the things which, if you had asked me, when I was in grad school, whether or not fascism was an interesting topic from a political philosophy point of view, I probably wouldn't have really known what to say, because from the point of view of actual working politics, it kind of seems like fascism was decisively refuted in 1945. It had a thing for a few decades, but at the same time, it's 100 years on now since it was born. Early part of the 20th century was when fascism started to sort of first come into vogue, and now it's kind of actually having sort of a moment again. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still very unpopular to self-identify as a fascist. There are some people out there that do that, but they are very much on the fringe. So while the label fascist is still definitely not in vogue and not terribly popular, there are a lot of ascendant politicians and political parties and other political movements in a whole variety of nations around the world right now that seem to be bearing the hallmarks of fascism. They're behaving in fascist way, they're engaging in fascist communicative actions, they're advocating for policies that can be reasonably identified as fascist. So we see this in a lot of different places, and it's not simply an illusion created by an overhyped internet culture where people like to throw around words like fascist and Nazi as though they were common slurs. Scholars and the popular press have been working hard recently trying to get their hands on fascism, both for their own purposes and to explain it to themselves and to each other. Just a small sampling here. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote a book a couple years back called Fascism: A Warning, which does a global tour, both historical and contemporary, of fascism and fascist movements. The political philosopher Jason Stanley wrote a really interesting and very accessible book called How Fascism Works: The Politics of Us and Them. And a whole variety of popular publications like this one here from the New Statesman have been examining and talking about the return of fascism. So again, you shouldn't just write this off as a bunch of paranoid reactionism from people who are overly sensitive or have leaned so far to the left that anyone to their right is a de facto fascist. Again, that rhetoric is out there, and I'm not encouraging it. But there are serious intellectuals, serious journalists, historians, political philosophers, political scientists, and diplomats who are trying to understand exactly what fascism is. How does it work? What is its appeal? Why is it that some people are attracted to this idea as a political philosophy? And perhaps most pressingly, why is it coming back now? Why, in the early part of the 21st century, is fascism starting to become back into vogue? Well, Paxton's work has focused on fascism for some time now. He wrote a book called The Anatomy of Fascism, and this article is a precursor to that that digests a lot of the main points of that book. And Paxton points out that while some people try to pin the origins of fascism or earlier on, most notably Bertrand Russell said that Plato was the world's first fascist, and a lot of his political philosophy actually had laid the groundwork for fascism. Paxton thinks that that's a mistake. It was a heat of the moment comment that Russell made. Fascism, he says, is a distinctly 20th century political innovation. Now, that's not to say that there aren't precursors to fascism earlier in history. Political organizations like tyranny, dictatorship, and despotism all have obvious similarities to fascism, but fascism proper did not come onto the scene until the 1910s in Europe. Exactly what the relationship is between fascism and these other forms of political authoritarianism is a nuanced thing. It's hard to explain right now, but hopefully by the time we get to the end of this lecture, it will make sense precisely what distinguishes fascism from these other broader terms. Now, if you compare and contrast this with other popular political philosophies like conservatism, liberalism, or socialism, these ideas are all hundreds of years old. They date back, at least as far as people like Edmund Burke, John Locke, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So there's a long tradition for these isms. But fascism is much younger and much newer than any of these, and it's also distinctive in important ways that are very hard to pin down. Giving a clear, unambiguous definition of fascism is particularly challenging, and Paxton would argue actually probably a fool's errand. You cannot pinpoint a single specific doctrine or set of doctrines that say this is what fascism is, because fascism, unlike conservatism, liberalism, or socialism, has no core principles. Now, there are people who have been fascist who have claimed these are the core principles of fascism, and they will write essays espousing the philosophy of fascism. Benito Mussolini wrote a book on that, saying that this is what fascism is about. But this is the tricky thing, according to Paxton, is that fascists are under no obligation to actually abide by what they claim their principles to be. They will say they believe one thing, and then a short time later they will turn around and espouse the exact opposite. Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, according to the fascists. There's no problem with completely changing your position on various issues or stances, as long as you keep abiding by some sort of general fascist tendencies, which I will explain as we go along through this essay. So, in other words, fascism is something that molds itself to the particular exigencies of the moment. It will take different shapes in different cultures at different times, and as the political realities start to change, fascism will adjust to change with them. So it is no problem at all finding many, many examples of fascist politicians engaging in outright and rank hypocrisy, unapologetically. They don't even feel the need to justify their actions. Everyone engages in hypocrisy to a certain extent. Every politician, every ideologue will sometimes fail to live up to their ideology. That's just human nature. We're fallible like that. But usually when that happens, ideologues at least have the decency to feel embarrassed, to try to hide or justify their actions. Fascists feel no need to do that at all. They can completely change their own platform and then look their supporters right in the face and say, what? This is the way the platform always has been. And if you remember otherwise, it's you who are wrong. It's you who are the traitor. So Paxton says if you want to understand what fascism is, you shouldn't look at what fascists say. Looking at fascist rhetoric and fascist philosophy is actually a mistake. You have to look at how fascists behave. To understand fascism, you have to look at what they do. If you can steal a line from Forrest Gump, if you will, fascists are what fascists do, not what they say. So this notion of watching how they behave makes it a little bit more appropriate for an historian to engage in rather than a political philosopher. So I think part of the reason why my own training in political philosophy didn't focus so much on fascism is precisely because political philosophers, as a rule, tend to look at what people write, and they often pay less attention to what they actually do. And so it's through the work of people like Paxton and other historians and political scientists who actually study their behavior that we start to get a better handle on exactly what fascism is. So let's say a little bit about the origins of fascism. The most unambiguous and undeniable examples of fascism are Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. These are the two sort of hallmark examples of fascism in the 20th century, and then heretofore in all of history for that matter. Mussolini actually is the person who got it started. He was the first person to lead a fascist party into power, and he named his party the Fascist Party. Originally, the name wasn't a name for a political philosophy. It was originally a name for a party after a Roman symbol called the fasce. Which, as you can sort of see here over on the right, is a bundle of reeds wrapped around an axe, which is used, both as a weapon, but more importantly as a symbol for strength through unity. The individual reeds you could probably snap over your knee pretty easily, but you bind them all together and they're very strong. So you see how the symbol works, right? When the people all come together and unite, they become very, very strong. So fascism, calls for people to unite and to come together to show solidarity and strength and unity. This particular picture that I have right here actually is from the United States House of Representatives, which obviously is a little embarrassing to have a fascist symbol in the House of Representatives. But it's worth remembering that building and this piece of sculpture right here actually was built long before fascism became what we think of today, long before the 20th century. So if you ever find yourself in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., you might notice these, which was, again, particularly awkward perhaps even during World War II. But they had the sense of history to not let the fascists steal a symbol entirely. So even though they didn't steal the symbol, they did pretty much take the name. Now, fascism no longer refers specifically to a particular party. It belongs to a series of movements. And Paxton breaks down, as the title of his essay suggests, fascist movements into 5 major stages of fascism. And Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy are the only 2 political systems that have ever made their way through all 5. Many have approximated the first few, but the full cycle of 5 is something that's only happened twice in history. Now, in the earliest stages of fascism, it is the ideas that count. This is when the intellectuals and the ideologues start sort of having the most important role to play. And when you read fascist philosophy, you will often see that it is in these early stages that they actually play the larger role. They make things like promises of renewal and reinvigoration of a nation that was once glorious but has since been crushed and defeated. Again, you can sort of imagine how this is going to sit well in Italy, right? They used to be the Roman Empire, and now, at the dawn of the 20th century, they were just one among many fairly petty European nations with their squabbles. So the promise of restoring Italy to its Roman glory is something that sounded really good to a lot of Italians who kind of felt like they had been let down by the recent history and recent politicians. There's a call for a invigoration to transform the nation, and then as the different parties start to get political traction, the purity has to be sacrificed, and compromises have to be made, and ideas have to be thrown out the window to adjust for the times, like I said a second ago, and you end up sort of leaving behind any kind of ideology, and what's left really is just power for power's sake. Fascism becomes stripped of its philosophical underpinnings and simply becomes a mechanism for social and political control that is justified by the exercise of power. So if there is anything that fascism ultimately is committed to, it is the idea that you do whatever it takes to gain and to maintain power. And if that means abandoning your principles, that means abandoning your principles. So the theorists that are attached to fascism either become disillusioned in some way and fall apart and no longer become fascists, or they ignore the contradictions, or they try to rationalize the contradictions. And anyone who has not bought into the fascist ideology usually can see this for the patent excuse-making that it actually is. Okay, let's turn now to the titular 5 stages of fascism. Let's start by outlining all 5 of them, and then we will take a slow walk through each of them. The first stage is the initial creation stage, or the Proto-Fascism stage. This is when you have small groups getting together and starting to talk about them, hooligans on the street, if you will, getting together and starting to form early-stage political parties. 2 is the rooting in the political parties. This is when those street gangs start to form a platform. They start to make connections to the existing political establishments, and oftentimes try to flex their muscle in a way that will get them more political traction and more political power. Then there's the actual acquisition of power, when fascists are brought into holding offices of some kind. This may be in the military, or it may be in civil or national political power. Then there's the exercise of power, when they oftentimes is most notoriously an example of Adolf Hitler, when he kicked away the existing political establishment and seized power and started using it for his own purposes, disregarding the existing political structures. And then the 5th and final stage is what Paxton calls either radicalization or entropy. This is a bifurcated stage. You go one of 2 directions. Hitler went one, Mussolini went the other. I'll explain all of these stages in more detail here in just a second. The key thing to note for now, though, is the recognition that a fascist movement can begin and then collapse before getting through all 5 stages. So Paxton is not saying that unless you make it through all 5 stages, you are not a fascist party. Or a fascist movement. Most fascist movements fail to make it all the way through. Again, only 2 have made it through all 5. But that doesn't mean the ones that have attempted to gain traction in other nations, such as the United Kingdom, or even in Greece, several other places have had nascent fascist parties that made it through one or two, but never quite made it to 3, 4, or 5. But the key thing for Paxton is this. All fascist movements proceed through these stages. Even if they don't make it through all 5, even if they only make it through 1, 2, or 3, this is still the blueprint that fascists have followed and have used in every nation where this has been attempted. So let's take a walk through each of these 5 stages in turn. Stage 1, Proto-Fascism. Fascism, according to Paxton, arises specifically as a result of perceived failures of liberal democracy. So you can't have fascism until you have a liberal democracy in place. This is why it's a mistake to say that the early examples of people like the political philosophy of Plato was fascist, as Bertrand Russell claimed. You don't get fascism until you get liberal democracy. The notion of constitutional guaranteed rights and so forth. What happens is after you get these sort of constitutional governments in which people have the right to participate in politics and to vote, you give people the promise that they will actually have the capacity to change things. And then what happens, of course, is that things don't change. It is still the rich and the connected and the elite that are in charge. Democracy is viewed as a sham. It's viewed as a way of placating the people rather than actually empowering the people. You give them this vote, but of course, the real decisions are still made in smoke-filled rooms by rich plutocrats and connected party members and so forth. So people start to feel disillusioned. They start to feel that the promise of democracy, the promise of liberal democracy, never came to fruition. And these countries that claim to be democracies are not really democracies. Democracy is not a name for a system that actually gives voice to the people or gives power to the people. Democracy is the name of a sham system, according to this sort of fascist way of thinking. It is worth noting that all democracies since World War I have had these proto-fascist movements where people are just disillusioned, where people often sort of fail to really sort of grasp anything of value to them in a democratic system. So disillusionment with democracy is one of the key first steps to developing a proto-fascist movement. Now, in spite of what I just said a second ago about genuine fascist movements only being a 20th century phenomenon, Paxton does say that the earliest proto-fascist movement that he can identify in the United States, at least, is the Ku Klux Klan. He says that the Ku Klux Klan sort of has all the hallmarks of a proto-fascist movement, but it's only that first stage. They didn't get beyond that. And you can sort of see why, right? During Reconstruction, a lot of Southern whites feared that their government no longer represented them. They were afraid that black people would now be given the franchise and they would be given political power, and their alleged position of social superiority was started to be threatened. So the white supremacists decided to create their own paragovernmental organizations, and that paragovernmental organization would fight on their behalf, and that would keep the white people in general, but in particular white people in the South, in positions of social authority and social power that they felt they were entitled to. And so it shouldn't surprise us at all, as according to Paxton's analysis, that in the United States, a lot of groups like neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan are still sort of sociological cousins. It's important not to conflate these groups. Sociologists will tell you that while obviously neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan are both white supremacist organizations, they are not the same. In fact, there's often a lot of bitter infighting between neo-Nazis and the Klan. So there are important, nuanced differences between them. I'm not going to dig into them, because right now my point is to draw attention to their similarities rather than their differences. In this picture I'm showing right here, you see men dressed in the robes of the Ku Klux Klan giving the Roman salute, the Sieg Heil, from the Nazis. So you sort of see there's a lot of inbreeding going on between these various groups. Okay, stage 2, rooting. If a nation's institutions are weak, then proto-fascist movements can gain a foothold in local or even national politics. So if you have parties that are supported by lots of people, if you have strong institutions that check against things like fighting in the streets, civil violence, vigilantism, then it's harder for fascist groups to really gain a foothold in politics. once fascist movements sort of start attracting people who are disaffected from the existing establishment, politicians and existing political parties recognize that they have to deal with them. They have to develop relationships with these fascist groups in order to protect their own interests. They have to try to sort of tap in to whatever it is that these fascists are actually building on. So political deadlock will often create opportunities. When you have the parties that are sort of butting heads and not actually accomplishing anything, not doing anything to help out the working class or help out the common people, then fascists can sort of step in to fill that void and say, look, these parties, they're corrupt. They're only looking out for their own interests. They don't care about you. They don't care about me. They only care about protecting their own bottom line. And obviously, there is some truth to this, right? Parties often do have divided interests. They care about their agenda, but they also care about perpetuating their power, because it's only through perpetuating their power that they can actually accomplish their agenda. So if you have not a lot of progress, not a lot of clear examples of things that the parties have done to benefit the people, that creates opportunity. That allows the fascists to step in and say, surrender power to us and we will get things done for you. We will cut through all the red tape. And this often happens by using the mechanisms of democracy to vote fascists in, and then once fascists are in place, they then kick away the ladder of democracy. They destroy the same democratic safeguards so they can allegedly do the business of the people. So they don't have to worry about checks and balances or courts or anything like that. They can do what the people really want. The fascists always claim to be the voice of the people, even if they are not popular at the polls. Fascist movements will often make common cause with the right. And this is an important nuance, I think, to recognize. Fascism is often claimed as if it's an extension of right-wing politics. And that is close but not quite accurate. Fascist movements are not the same as the right wing. There's usually an established right-wing party in place in these governments. And they recognize that it is in their own best interest. It's savvy politicking to make common cause with the fascist movements. This is usually not the case with the left-wing movements. In fact, actually, it's often time when there is a budding socialist left in a country that fascist movements will come along and say to the right wing, hey, the socialists are coming to power, man. They're communists. They're going to take everything away from you. They're going to kick you out. You have to come to us. And if the right and the fascists join together, then we can fight the socialists, we can fight the communists. It should come as no surprise that the very first victims of the Holocaust actually weren't Jews or gypsies or homosexuals. They were Marxists. The first people sent off to concentration camps were Marxist intellectuals and Marxist party members. So oftentimes when there is a rise in left-wing socialist movements in a country, the fascists will rise to push back against them, trying to sell themselves as the only option to conservative and right-wing movements in order to beat back the socialists. In their desperation to do anything they can to stop the Marxists, the communists, the socialists, the right will capitulate to fascists and give them power. In the words of Karl Marx himself, there's a specter haunting Europe. That specter terrifies the right wing so much. Oftentimes these are aristocrats, these are businessmen, and they're terrified that if the Marxists come in, what happened in Russia during the October Revolution, when all the czars were kicked off and decapitated and executed, they see that happening to them. So they say, well, we don't necessarily like the fascists, but we like the fascists more than we like the Marxists. So the fascist vigor, their strength, is seen as a solution to that specter haunting Europe, and again, in Marxist words. All right, stage 3, acquisition of power. According to Paxton, fascism has never, ever successfully come to power by means of a military coup. Now, that doesn't mean that fascists haven't attempted to come to power by a military coup. They have, but what happens when you get that, when you get open fighting in the streets, actually, you end up making enemies of groups that the fascists actually need to support them once they come to power, most notably police and military organizations. So attempted fascist coups will often fail, and in the wake of their failure, what you get actually is the rise of military dictatorships. The military comes along, crushes the fascist coup, and in the process says, look, hey, some of the same things the fascists were saying. Look, the elected democratic government was unable to protect you. They are weak, they're ineffectual, so the military is now going to take charge. So fascist coups are never a good thing, because even whether or not they succeed or whether or not they fail, usually that is the end of liberal democracy right there. The only question is whether or not you end up having a fascist government or you end up having a military dictatorship instead. So how have the fascist movements that have succeeded managed to succeed, if not through coups? Well, they succeed by gaining some political power, gaining a foothold, and then subverting the existing structures. It's a corruption from within kind of situation. And again, it works by making common cause with conservatives. Conservatives give them power in an effort to protect and restore the nation. And this happened in parallel in two circumstances. King Emmanuel in Italy thought that he could control Mussolini. He saw Mussolini had lots of followers, lots of people who liked him, so he thought, you know what, if I make allies with Mussolini, then Mussolini's support will become my support. And that did not happen. Mussolini came to power, and then he ended up basically displacing the king. The king never was officially dethroned, but he lost all effective political power. He became just a figurehead, and it was Mussolini who was in charge of the country for almost 2 decades. Same thing in Germany. President von Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor under the illusion that he would be able to control Hitler. That by giving Hitler power, a modicum of power, Hitler would be thankful to Hindenburg and would then work with him in order to push back socialist movements. And again, if you know your history, you know it didn't work out too well. Hitler ended up taking absolute power away from Hindenburg and away from all of the existing political establishments. So if there's a lesson to be learned here, it's this: don't underestimate fascists. That was the mistake that King Emmanuel made. It was in Italy, and it's the mistake that President von Hindenburg made in Germany. Fascists often look clownish. They often look like they're just theatrics. Like they're just a bunch of young kids posing in the streets, flexing their muscles, trying to make themselves feel strong. So it's a tempting thing to do, to just view them as a bunch of idiots and fools. But that's a mistake. And if we're going to learn from history, this is one of the important lessons from history. Don't underestimate them. Don't underestimate them at home, and don't underestimate them abroad. They may look foolish, but they are incredibly dangerous. This takes us to stage 4, the exercise of power. Mussolini and Hitler gained power by establishing different coalitions. In pretty much any society, there's going to be some existing power structures that anyone coming to power is either going to have to work with or against. So some standard examples here: the military, existing political parties, the church leadership, business leaders, the landscape made by these different groups will vary from country to country, and it varied in Italy than it did in Germany. Mussolini, for example, started off his political career as an avowed atheist, and he was talking about how all religion was bad and it was corrupting. But then when it came time for him to come to power, he recognized that the Roman Catholic Church had too much authority, cultural and political authority, to just flip off. So he brokered a deal with them. He worked with them rather than against them. So again, that's another example of them not having any core principles and just sort of doing whatever is politically expedient. Hitler, by contrast, did not have as much of an established church, because Germany, of course, was more Protestant than Catholic. So the Protestant churches were more factioned off. There wasn't a single unified church that Hitler had to worry with or make deals with. So making deals with the church was less of an important thing in order for Hitler to come to power. I'm not going to walk through all the details here, but you get the idea, right? You have to build different coalitions depending on the local politics. And as such, that pure ideology, that pure fascist ideology, which a lot of intellectuals put on paper, was compromised, was thrown out because it was an impediment to power. And like I said, if fascists are about anything, it is about achieving and wielding power. So fascism promises to be the voice of the people, but they have to get power by making common cause with the conservative elite. And this, according to Paxton, is why it's a mistake to include Stalinism amongst the lists of fascist movements. It's not because Stalin wasn't a dictator. He was. It's not because he didn't trample on human rights. He absolutely did. Stalin was every bit the monster that history makes him out to be. But the label fascist isn't appropriate because during the communist revolution, the communists didn't cooperate with the conservative elite. It eliminated them. Rather than making common cause with them, it destroyed them. This is a sentiment that Umberto Eco is going to, well, if you'll pardon the pun, echo in his essay Fascism, in which he says that he agrees it's inappropriate to say that Stalin was a fascist, but for slightly different reasons. Eco says Stalin isn't a fascist because he actually had principles. He actually believed in something. Now, again, that's not to say he didn't betray those principles, wasn't hypocritical. As I said, all of us are at some point or another. But Stalin at least tried to hide his hypocrisy, tried to make apology for it, rather than pretending as though it's what he always believed, which is what Mussolini and Hitler did as their views changed. So yes, Stalin, dictator, bad guy, terrible guy, but not a fascist according to Paxton. All right, fifth and final stage, entropy, or radicalization or entropy. Now, fascism comes into power by promising glory, promising conquest, promising power. We will take power away from the people who don't deserve it, and we will give it back to you, the people. Mussolini was not able to deliver this for very long. I mean, he held on to power for a reasonably long period of time, almost 2 decades, like I said. But at a certain point, during World War II, he was unable to continue delivering these victories to the people. And so he settled into what Paxton calls a routine authoritarianism. The Italian, was supposed to be the next Roman Empire, ended up being basically just the Italian peninsula and some places, a couple of small places that they managed to conquer throughout Africa. They were not the powerhouse that Mussolini had promised them to be. And so his people ended up being disillusioned with him. He was eventually kicked out of office, and then he was hunted down, and his corpse ended up hanging from a gas station next to his mistress. It was a very ignoble end. So yeah, this is the entropy half of the entropy. The party falls apart. It's unable to maintain power. It's unable to deliver on the promises. Hitler went the other route, according to Paxton. Hitler doubled down. Hitler's military was stretched thin throughout World War II, but he kept insisting that they could go further. During the early days, they invaded Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland. Okay, they managed to deliver on their power then, but they kept on going into Denmark, to Norway, to Belgium, to the Netherlands, to France, and then ultimately, of course, probably the biggest mistake Hitler ever made, betraying the Soviet Union. Hitler thought that Stalin was going to betray him, so he chose to betray him first. Apparently, that was wrong. Stalin actually was not planning on betraying Hitler. They had a pact, but once Germany had to hold all these different territories and fight a war on both the Western and the Eastern fronts, it became impossible for fascism to keep delivering, for German fascism, Nazism, to keep delivering what it promised. So this is the radicalization, though, right? Whereas Mussolini recognized when he was stretched too thin and tried to dial back, ultimately leading to his party falling apart, Hitler just kept doubling down, a sentiment that Hitler was rather fond of saying. I thought for a long time it was his sentiment, but apparently it's not. But it is something that he quoted a lot. Better an end with horror than a horror without end. This is a man who's willing to drive his country off a cliff. That is radicalization. We will fight until the bitter end, until every last one of us is dead and bleeding in the streets. Very different route than the route that Mussolini took, but both of them end in failure, either entropy or radicalization. Now, it's at this point that Paxton finally comes around to actually giving a definition of fascism in the essay. This is strange. Normally you start with the definition and work backwards to support it. But Paxton actually goes in the opposite direction. He tries to sort of lay the foundation for the stages of fascism, and only at the end of the essay offers a definition. So here is his definition. Paxton defines fascism as a system of political authority and social order intended to reinforce the unity, energy, and purity of communities in which liberal democracy stands accused of division and decline. So, why didn't he start the essay with that? Why didn't he begin with that definition and then show how the stages match it? Well, because, like I've been trying to say from the beginning, the definition of fascism actually is something that is in flux. It doesn't have a solid core. It mutates and it transforms. And so Paxton warns about chasing the so-called fascist minimum, which is a mistake that a lot of academics and scholars, in particular philosophers, made, trying to define what fascism is by looking at their doctrines, looking at their writings, rather than looking at their behavior. This is the closest you can do to reconstructing a definition based on their behavior, but even this definition, he admits, is one that you don't want to put too much stock in, not because he doesn't believe it's accurate, but because if you start thinking about fascism in terms of something that fits a definition, then you fail to understand the nimbleness of actual fascist politicians and political movements, which does not feel pinned down to any particular definition. All right, I want to add my own postscript here to this conversation. There's probably an obvious question that has crossed a lot of your minds as you're watching this, because as I am recording this lecture, the United States is heading up to a presidential election in which one of the two candidates has been rather notoriously and routinely accused of being a fascist. So the question is Donald Trump a fascist? And this is no small part of the reason why I'm recording this lecture now and why it is that I'm covering this material now, because it is relevant to the conversation. Now, it's worth noting that some scholars, in particular both Jason Stanley and Madeleine Albright, who I cited earlier in this lecture, have said, well, he may not be technically a fascist, in the literal sense, but he's close enough. I think Stanley's phrase is that he engages in fascist politics and in fascist rhetoric, even if he obviously has not established a fascist government in the United States. He hasn't made it to stage 3 or 4 of Paxton's scale, if you want to put it that way. And Albright, again, didn't out and out accuse him of being a fascist, but there is a chapter in her book, Fascism Warning, on Donald Trump and his presidency. So it's pretty clear that she thinks that the charge of fascism against Donald Trump is not an unreasonable one. At the same time, though, there are other scholars, including Robert Paxton himself, who actually say it isn't really helpful to label Donald Trump a fascist. Again, it's not so much that it's false, so much that that term ends up not actually informing our dialogue more. Paxton isn't immune to the concerns that people who call Trump a fascist have. He thinks those concerns are reasonable. But when you use the F word on someone like Trump, you end up just driving people into their corners, as it were. People who like Trump just think it's ridiculous and they stop talking, and people who don't like Trump will just use that label because it's an effective label rather than because it actually gives us some traction on understanding Trump and how he works. Now, I'm going to leave it up to you to decide, given what I've covered here, whether or not you think this criteria and to what extent matches the political movement that Donald Trump has built in the early part of the 21st century. But regardless of whether or not you think it's appropriate to call Trump a fascist, I do hope one thing is clear. The United States is not immune to the threat of fascism. We like to believe in the title for a famous novel that it can't happen here, but the whole point of that novel was Sinclair Lewis was the novelist. But the whole point of Lewis's novel was precisely that it can happen here. And we should not let our guard down. So maybe you don't think Trump is a fascist. That's fair. You can make that case, make that argument. But even if he isn't, the social conditions that lead to fascism rising to power are very much evident in the United States today. Partisan gridlock, disillusionment with liberal democracy, all of these sorts of things. So even if Trump is not a fascist, the prospect of someone else, whether or not they accept the label of fascist, they probably won't, because like I say, that's particularly unpopular, but they could easily start building on these sorts of weaknesses, these sorts of conditions, and following the sorts of playbooks that were laid out by people like Mussolini and Hitler. So it is not alarmism to say that many nations around the world, including the United States, are at risk of fascism. Whether or not a particular politician or a particular political party or a particular government qualifies as fascist can quickly become a distraction. It can quickly become an academic point about whether or not it meets that fascist minimum that Paxton talks about. Don't get distracted by that rhetorical debate. Take seriously the threats of fascism around the world, because whether or not you want to use that term, the dangers that political movements and political systems and governments that are in that ballpark have, and the dangers that they impose on both home nations and nations abroad, is very, very real. So take this talk, take this concern seriously.